Good morning, podcast, and welcome to a new special episode on the Pierre Lambert Show. I am your host, and today I've got an incredible guest, and we're going to dive into a topic that I have never explored before. And I thought to dip the toes, we're going to bring someone, and that person today is Laura Dawn. Oh, whoa, Laura Dawn. Laura is the host of the Psychedelic Leadership Podcast, a microdosing mentor for executive and top performers, and has been leading transformational retreats for over 10 years. Laura has a degree in finance and entrepreneurship and over 2 decades of exploring altered states of consciousness. Currently, she's completing a master in science specializing in creativity and change leadership, exploring the intersection between psychedelics and creative problem solving, helping leaders and teams unlock innovative solutions to the complex challenges we collectively face. All right, Laura D, thank you so much for making it through this introduction. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Pierre. So happy to be here with you.
We're going to have to make that intro sound a little better after, but I try my best. Laura, I'm very intrigued, excited, curious, and I think everyone listening might be really, what is happening? What are we talking about? How is this going to work? The whole world is seeing obviously a shift in the narrative around psychedelics and their usage. And I felt that instead of leaving it up to people to randomly find by themselves through people that may have heard of it or not, I thought, why don't we bring an expert in that field, i.e. you, to actually get us a little bit of insight into this ecosystem and how it can be used or not used for creativity and how it can work. So this is kind of the overview for anyone watching. And obviously, Laura D, we're gonna dive into your story also. I'm kind of very curious to see how you got into that space that is very different from what everyone else might think at first note. So, Laura, again, thank you, welcome, and can I ask you? Can we just start somewhere that you and I were discussing yesterday before we started recording? What happened when you were a kid when it came to creativity and drawing with your teachers, if I'm remembering correctly?
Yeah. It's so funny because I just think it's so ironic that I'm now completing my master's in creativity studies because I think just like many other people have had this experience where when I think it was in grade 2, and I had this teacher, her name, she used to say, "My name is Miss Johnston with a T." And she was this like kind of old crotchety woman. And she came over and to my desk and said that I would never be creative because I couldn't draw like the girl sitting next to me. And I so desperately wanted to be good at drawing. And after that day, that was kind of a traumatic experience, that got etched into my memory, that shaped me and my belief system about what creativity is. Moving forward, even still to this day, even though I study creativity, I've actually had a really big narrative shift around what creativity really is. But I actually still am working through those internal blocks around drawing and putting pen to paper. And it's actually just been a really amazing process to witness my healing and grow through that process. But I think a lot of people have had experiences like this. And when I share this with other people, I often hear other people express to me, "Oh my God, I had a similar experience happen." And I don't know, Pierre, do you know who Brené Brown is? Do you know the research of Brené Brown?
Yes, Brené Brown.
She's
She loves to talk about vulnerability.
Yeah. So she is an incredible researcher and she's collected over 400,000 pieces of data from people. And she found that about 80% of people have had some kind of experience in elementary school that sort of planted a negative belief that then negatively impacted them into adulthood. And of the 80%, about 50% of the 80%, it was related to creativity. And I just found that so
Yeah.
interesting. And, and it actually parallels the other research that only about a quarter of people have the belief that they are creative, or a third of people. So it's really interesting times, especially to be talking about psychedelics and creativity, because I see them as both going sort of through this like cultural, like destigmatization. They're both going
Yeah.
through like a cultural rebrand right now, so it's
Rebrand
kind of
is a good
interesting.
word. That's true. It's completely that. It's how you're perceived. Suddenly you're called Facebook, the next day it's Meta, and whether you want it or not, it does change your perception of it. Um
Yep.
well, so okay, so elementary school, how old are you? Because I'm not super familiar with the school systems. Like how old were you? And kind of a weird question is, do you remember as a kid what it did, or like how you processed it, or how you thought about it? I have troubles remembering my child stuff sometimes, but do you first, how old were you, and do you remember how that worked for you?
Yeah, gosh, I was probably like 8 or 9 years old-ish,
Yeah.
maybe 10, in that very young age. And then, in grade 3 up until about grade 6, I was in school with this girl named Jenica Lounsbury. I'll never forget it. And she was just this incredible drawer. And for the rest of my time, I used to be so afraid of giving it a go and
Mm,
drawing, because it was in this like comparative mentality and this comparative mindset. And it's so funny now that I'm studying, creativity research. It just, so much of my own personal experience mirrors that, because we see that people who have fixed beliefs about their
mhm,
capacity in whatever creativity domain we're talking about, then don't go and like embody those actions and those behaviors with a belief. We can dive in more into this, but essentially I didn't try to draw or try to be creative in the ways that, I don't want to equate drawing and artistic expression with creativity. And I think that that's actually a big part of like the narrative shifts
yeah.
that's going on for us collectively right now. But I was so afraid to just see what would face me, like face back from the page,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of like self-judgment and shame around that. So I would say, like, in that area, it really just prevented me from exploring and playing in that particular creative area.
I see. I love what you're saying, because I think so many of us can relate. There's always a point where either a teacher or a friend, a parent is like, "No, I think you suck at that," and just that thought, or that, "Oh, I'm not good at this," which means nothing. You might have just tried for the first time. Who the heck knows? Really impacts us. And I mean, through photography, a lot of people that I meet tell me, "Oh, but you're creative, you have this," and I don't consider myself really like creative in that sense either. It's just like, okay, I'm having fun, I'm trying things, and I feel like a lot of, for me at least, creativity is almost like a muscle. If you don't train, just letting go of what is supposed to be when you're doing something and just trying, it helps a lot. So. It always like shocks me, the impact of those like early teachers on our lives. And it's like when you realize, you're like, oh, maybe I should pay more attention to what they do if I have kids one day.
Right. Oh my gosh. Especially those first 7 years of our lives we're just like sponges.
Yeah.
And that is actually the kind of imprinting that happens. And what our beliefs are really end up becoming the way who we embody in our
Hmm.
lives. I mean, there's so much we could actually talk about in just that category. But, and so for me, it's actually been this whole process of redefining the narrative, because
Okay.
the narratives and the stories that we tell ourselves influence the actions that we
Hmm.
take and the paths that we choose for ourselves. And it was really psychedelics actually that helped me rewrite some very deeply ingrained narratives and help me forge my own path forward, which I think is really what we're all being called to do right now.
Hmm. That's okay. That's a very important point to dive into. Yeah. How does one even go about, I will say that before you can even like try to work on something, how do you even bring awareness to it?
That's such a good question. So the way that I like to think of it, okay. I'm going to give an analogy. I use this analogy in a lot of the programs that I teach. So it's almost like we're in our adult lives. It's like we're living in a glass room, okay? And we can see off into the distance because it's glass, and we might think to ourselves like, oh, I want that thing over there. I want to align with that. I want to go for that. But then we kind of walk right into the glass wall, but we can't see that that's our boundary and that's sort of our growth edge. And we kind of keep paying it, like noticing, we can start paying attention to the patterns, to what are the patterns that keep sabotaging our growth and the path that we're choosing. And so I find that like working with psychedelics teaches us, first of all, about perception and how we pay attention. So, I mean, this is really kind of a lot to dive into, but they teach you how to pay more attention to what you're paying attention to in your life. So if you keep paying attention to the same things that keep limiting you in those self-reinforcing, self-sabotaging behaviors, then you just start paying attention to the patterns. Like, why do I still keep dating like the same kind of archetype? Or why do I make it this far in my career and then self-sabotage in these ways? And what are the patterns that keep like poking their heads up in our lives, and then paying attention to that, and then looking at sort of like the root causes of that. And psychedelics really help us do that in a lot of ways and help us essentially rewrite those narratives, because I think at the core of it, we are playing, we're the main actors on the stage of our lives, and it's really all a narrative. It's all the story that we tell ourselves. That's why you can go to a dinner party with a good friend, and let's say you're both sitting next to the same person in between you, having the same conversation, and you're driving home with your friend and you're saying, wow, that guy was a real jerk. And your other friend is saying, wow, that guy was so funny. Like, what a charming, and why do we have those different experiences? Well, we see what we believe, and we pay attention to those deeply rooted belief systems that were given to us as children. And it's actually a profound statement to say this, that we see what we believe. You can actually spend the rest of your life unpacking that and playing with it and starting to notice it. But if you want to see what the results of your limiting beliefs are and your empowering beliefs, just look at your life. It's literally reflecting back to you what you believe to be true, and you pay attention to that. So like, I know we're getting kind of technical here, but stick with me for a second. So in every given moment, we're exposed to about 4 billion bits of data, right? And the brain is very good at streamlining what we pay attention to. And there are some core things we pay attention. We're biologically hardwired to pay attention to our safety and to, things that might prevent, our safety and stability. But we also pay attention to things that have high emotional arousal. That's part of linked to safety. But we also primarily, the third big bucket of what we pay attention to is our past experience. Okay, so it's easier for me to go to that dinner party, and let's say I have a belief that all men are jerks, okay, which a lot of women do have that kind of belief. Then I'm going to look for that kind of data and fit that data into the box of what I already believe to be true, because it's energy efficient, and that's the way that our mind works, right?
So it's like the hammer looking for the nail, basically. Right.
Exactly. And so we're constantly, those little games as children where you reach for the square and you put it in the square box and then it fits in. We're doing that all the time with data. So like, out of 4 billion bits of information, we all have mechanisms in the brain, like the thalamus, the reduction valve. For people who follow, psychedelic literature, Aldous Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception. He's talking about the thalamus opening up. And that's why in psychedelic journeys, we're like, whoa, there's all this information coming at us. But those are also safety mechanisms so that we can like be in waking consciousness, walk and talk, walk across the street. And so it's really interesting that like, I'm literally constantly picking out the same 2,000 bits of data to confirm what I already believe to be true. And so once we understand the sort of core underlying mechanisms for which perception works and consciousness works, which actually psychedelic research and science is really one of the best ways that we're actually learning about consciousness right now. And so when we learn the way that we perceive, then we start empowering ourselves to make change.
Yeah.
So when we're coming back to this analogy of being in the glass room, I see like the same patterns. We keep running into those same invisible patterns, same patterns keep showing up. But it's like Jedi training in the sense where I can say, no, Pierre, instead of like walking right into the glass wall, look at it from this angle. And maybe you'll see like a glint of light pop off and then you see the glass wall. And then once you know how to pay attention to it, you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to work with this now. I'm going to heal this aspect of myself. I'm going to rewrite this narrative, rewrite this belief in a way that actually allows me to make progress and walk in alignment with the vision of what I'm creating in my life.
Wow. There's so much to unpack. I love it. It's so good because it is exactly what happens. We go through experiences and we look for similar experiences. It's like you travel. You go to another country, it's like in my town. It's like in this country. It's like in that, it's every time you're trying to link it back to data you have from previous experiences. So as a child, you're obviously accumulating all those data, as I imagine. And that's when, after you create those links, you're basically creating your operating system. I find, at least that's what I see with my daughter. It's fascinating to watch. It's almost like a reflection of you as an adult because they pick up some things you do and you're like, oh, did I do that? And you're like, whoops.
Right.
Danger.
Right. Yep. Well, we learn by association. That's the way the mind works. It's more energy efficient to learn by fitting things into an existing framework. And if you were given sort of a shitty framework as a child, then you're up against just more limitations in terms of what you're perceiving and the narrative that you tell yourself about what life is. And this is the difference between a really happy, fulfilled, inspired life versus a life that's, the opposite of that, depressed or, unfulfilled or constantly searching for meaning and purpose. And, not that we don't go through those phases in our lives, we're human, but it really is a total mindset shift around how we engage with the narrative of our lives.
So we're gonna dig and give a little intro on what the psychedelics are. What does it mean? I'm gonna ask you that question just before, guys. If you're listening, obviously none of that is medical advice. Just so you know, check if you have a psychiatrist. Check with them around the use, and also it's different legalities, different countries, different states. So just make sure you're within your own rules and boundaries. And last but not least, those are beautiful compounds that can be also very powerful. And it's just like drinking a bottle of wine and then driving. It's not always, there are safe ways to do things and there is like not so safe, which usually yields the results you might hear on TV or in the stories of bad things happening. So with that said, I just want to, and Laura, feel free to put disclaimers anywhere because that's something I really appreciate with the content you're sharing. And what I looked at is you actually tell people, hey, this is not for everyone, be careful, etc. Now, before we go any further on those beautiful compounds in a way, there are also ways of accessing alternate states of consciousness. What does it mean? It can be prayer, it can be dancing, it can be meditation, breath work. There's tons of ways. Let's just, from my understanding and experience, it's just that those compounds, a lot of them being completely natural, are just highways to get to the same states, right? Then you can work with them a little more. Just like you would, put paprika on your dish to spice it up. You will take a compound to actually access something differently or just reality differently. That's what I understood. But Laura, please tell me, I'm no expert, so I just wanted to give a little brief disclaimer / intro for peeps. So what do we talk about here? Yeah. What are we talking about when we say psychedelics, consciousness?
Okay. So just like lay of the land, cultures across the world for millennia have been working with plant medicines. We often refer them to sacred plant medicines to move into another dimension, being able to perceive another dimension, also known as an altered state of consciousness. So we also naturally go into an altered state of consciousness every single night when we go to sleep. Right.
It's
So
true.
an easy way, if people are listening who have never worked with a psychedelic before, then think about how different your dream state is versus waking consciousness. It's a great way to think about it. And so there were a lot of different names that were actually tossed around before psychedelic stuck. And so psychedelic actually means mind manifesting. So it's actually beautiful that we opened with everything that we opened, because what I was expressing in all of that opening, in getting actually rather technical about perception, is that your beliefs manifest your reality. And so in a way, psychedelics help to amplify the way that you perceive reality and give you a different perspective on the way that you're engaging with life. So we're talking about whether it's a plant medicine like ayahuasca that has, DMT compounds in it, or psilocybin, or we could, look at LSD, which is also a very powerful psychedelic, synthetic, although it did originally come from the ergot plant. And then we have, mescaline and peyote, and these are very, and I actually just want to say that the way that we talk about various medicines is really important. Like, there's not so much sensitivity in the way that I talk about LSD, but the way that I talk about peyote it needs to be actually held in a very sort of specific way, because there are a lot of cultures that work with that medicine, and the way that we talk about it is actually important. And so we want to hold that with like a lot of respect and a lot of care for those cultures that work with these medicines for generations upon generations in a very ceremonial way. And so these are compounds that, affect the brain mostly through the 5-HT2A receptor site in the brain that fundamentally change the way that we perceive reality. I mean, there is so much to unpack there, but that's essentially it. It's a hallucinogenic compound. And we also could use the word entheogen. A lot of people like that name as well. And entheogen is a name for the way that we connect to God or spirit. So there's, many ways that we can look at this from a shamanic perspective, or an indigenous perspective, or a science perspective, or, especially like within a neuroscience perspective, what's actually happening in the brain. So essentially compounds that are hallucinogenic that allow us to change the way we perceive reality.
Oh, beautifully explained. It's great. And I'll just add to that from my understanding is that the I think it's Stanislav Grof who said that, and it was that psychedelics are to consciousness, or like to the brain what the telescope is for space exploration in a way. Meaning it's a great tool, and I feel for my photographer friends out there, it's almost like you're shooting always with a 50 millimeter, with the same lens all your life, same focal length. You see things the same way. And as much as you want to see wider or narrower, it's very difficult. But suddenly it's as if for a few hours you can put a very wide angle lens, and suddenly you see a lot wider, or you might see super detail into one infinite thing that you would have never noticed. So it just changes your perception for a certain amount of time. That's how I like to see it. And then you put back your normal lens, but now you know that you can change the lenses, and that is
my God.
that is the thing that never goes away.
I love this analogy. I'm going to use that if that's okay
Go
with
ahead.
you.
Absolutely.
If I have permission, I love that analogy. Good one.
Yeah, I thought about when we're chatting, I was like, because I've heard it put differently, but I'm like, everyone's knows photography here, so I'm like, it's like you shoot always with the same prime focal length, 50 millimeter. And now you can go at 14, you go back to 50, and now you know there is another lens, or like you can see it wider, or no. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So a lot to unpack. We'll get into the creative side. How did you get into that space? What's your comic book story on that?
Yeah, well, I would say as a child, I was very immersed in my dream realm. And it's funny because I've interviewed quite a lot of people on the Psychedelic Leadership podcast, and I have noticed a core sort of thread and theme amongst many people who started working with psychedelics and altered states of consciousness from a younger age. And that was definitely the case for me. My dream realms were so vivid, and I just hated school. I thought school was the most boring thing you could possibly do with your time. I did everything in my power to always get out of it. And I was also an athlete as a kid too, which I would love to actually share about in a moment. But I would be so excited to go home and go to bed and go into dream realm. And a lot of times in my experience, I would have these moments where I'd have to like ask my dad or my family, like, did that really happen, or was that a dream? Like, it was very like mixed into
Yeah.
my reality, and so vivid. And I think that just sparked an interest for me around altered states in general.
Hmm.
And then when I was really young, I had someone in my family that was a lot older than me and who was starting to experience psychedelic journeys that would express some of the things that he was going through. And so it's so funny because I need to be so careful around legalities and all the things. But I would hear stories about magical lands, at about like 10 years old, and be able to be like, wow. And there was just like seeds that were sort of planted in my consciousness. And then I was about 14 or 15 and I had my first high dose psilocybin experience. So I was quite young. And I like to say to people, I kind of joke that like, psychedelics and plant medicines like hand raised me and like forged me into the woman that I am today, and so it really was such a parallel. Like I grew up learning how to grow up and be who
Yeah.
I am on this path through just many, many, many journeys over the years. And yeah, and then also paralleling just my upbringing in the family that I had. I grew up with two entrepreneurial parents, very different landscape then as an entrepreneur than it is now. Like everyone and their mothers, brothers, fathers, sisters are entrepreneurs now. But growing up at that time, it was so different, And so my parents really taught me a lot about how to look for opportunity and how to perceive opportunity. And I pitched my first business plan when I was about 8 years old. I was just a kid. We used to have family dinners together. And then by dessert, you pitched your idea to the rest of the family. And so that was a big part of my upbringing as well, which actually really links into what my narrative around creativity shaped into as I grew up. Actually, what it means to be a visionary creative, which is really a big part of the framework that I teach in my programs. So it was just a strong calling to sort of hurl myself over the deep end and see what happens. You mentioned travel earlier too. I also had a very strong propensity to go to very foreign countries. And it was sort of another way that I was like hurling myself over the deep end to be like, what's this experience going to be like? And I think, it's just always been this like deep drive, this deep curiosity around what else we can experience in this life.
That's so good. The travel part, I never thought about it that way, but you're right. It's exactly that too. It's you're putting yourself in a different perspective framework. Like you go to certain countries, you're like, wow, it's like a million years from operating the way I would ever think and do. And that opens up your mind also. I mean, I started traveling young and that always had a huge impact. It's the same. That's
Right.
really, yeah, that's
Right.
fascinating. I love that.
R- Well, and just to add one more layer there, I started traveling, like really intense traveling when I was about 16, backpacking. And I actually also did quite a lot of entheogenic medicines in other very, very foreign countries.
Hmm.
And not that I absolutely do not recommend that to anyone because there are very harsh drug laws in a lot of these countries. And but it actually, it gave me this experience of being able to really witness how different of an experience that other cultures have.
Yeah.
Especially as I spent many years of my life studying Buddhism for about the last almost 17 years. I've been really deeply immersed in Eastern philosophy. And then having these experiences and then being able to be exposed to foundationally Buddhist countries where that's like a primary just way of perceiving, it had such a big impact on me
Hmm.
in my life.
Yeah. And how did so what was your mindset around that? Because okay, I'll start with my example so you can understand the question. I grew up in a very traditional way and with a traditional mindset. Like I never really questioned much until I was like 5 years into my job, and then I had my own mind shift just by reading books. And for example, on drugs, it was very much like all drugs are evil, everything's bad. Alcohol is not a drug, of course not. And it was really that narrative for me. It's like almost you smoke a joint and tomorrow you're doing heroin under a bridge, and you're homeless. And people who smoke joints are lazy and they don't do anything. Literally, this is literally the world I grew up in. I have no shame of saying it. This is a narrative I was fed and that I understood. Now, many, many, many examples, and another guest is gonna come up of like people that I know who smoked weed and like completely blew that out of the window because they're like amazing entrepreneurs. I'm like, oh well, look at that. How was your world around it? How was it perceived, and kind of how did you navigate or dip your toe into it? Because I had to unlearn or like realize a lot what I did not know actually was just like an education actually on the whole topic.
Yeah, I would say like it kind of happened in different phases, but because I started working with psychedelics before I even knew that there was a narrative around them being
Mm,
wrong or bad, and that's why I feel like this path and like even speaking with you and where I'm at in my journey was my dharma from the beginning of my life.
yeah,
And so there were sections of time where I was working with psychedelics less, like during university, like window, and I was studying entrepreneurship and being a little bit more focused in like the commerce, getting caught up in
yeah.
like that sort of matrix. And then as soon as I left, I left my hometown and I packed a bag and I left and I actually never went back. And
Mm,
in those 2 years after university, I remember very, very distinct LSD trips that were way out there in the world, just on the edge of nowhere, where I was really grieving the process of the education that the masses are getting,
mm-hmm,
where it was this like defragging my brain and my body and feeling my body like carrying the education of the stock market and, like all of the financial structures and all of it. And just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing and having these journeys of just like real deep grief, like grieving for myself and for the collective of
yeah.
humanity. And that was really informative for me. But I
Mm,
never actually, not once in my life, I've always been super stubborn. I've always been this kid that was like hard-headed and like wanted to beat to my own drum. It was like, oh, you guys
yeah.
are all going left. I want to go right. Like I never wanted to do the thing that I was supposed to do. And I feel incredibly grateful that I had two very supportive parents. My father, one of the best beliefs that he gave me that was sort of a parallel with the medicine was that whatever I thought in my mind, I could make a reality and that I could
Mm,
create whatever I wanted to create. And that, I
that's so
would like, there was
important.
so much other stuff that I've like navigated with healing and my relationship with my father, but I would take all of the hardship just to keep that one belief that he
Mm,
gave me. And my mother used to always tell me, I trust your judgment. I trust your judgment. So I was raised by a mother who is still my best friend, who she's the
yeah.
closest person in my life, who, we joke now that she would say, I knew one day the rest of the world would catch up to you, because I was like, this was 20 years ago
Yeah.
and saying, hey, there's really something to this. There's really, really something to this experience that is fundamentally transformative and helpful and healing, because I used to struggle with depression and addiction throughout my teenage years, and
Hmm.
it was helpful. Now, there wasn't a framework, an educational framework that went with it, but I knew that it was helpful. And actually, in high school, I started intuitively microdosing. So this
Hmm.
was like 20 years ago, and I remember the first time I heard the term microdose, and I was like, oh, like, duh, that's like obvious, But that was the first time. And I was like, I had already been doing that practice to be more focused and engaged in school until I actually stopped going to class altogether about grade 8. And I started self-studying because I thought school was such a waste of time. And my parents supported me in that too. I actually only had to go to 1 hour of being with a tutor to replace the whole week of school. And
Wow.
so I had a lot of free time on my hands. And also was more of like a risk taker, and I've always been sort of like a risk taker and, got into
You
all sorts
mentioned
of trouble.
athlete also, right? You were into sport.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that really shaped me in like the level of dedication and determination. And I dove for many years and trained competitively and also played water polo. And those early sort of years of shaping my life to like self-discipline. And importantly, another big key to those years was my coaches teaching me how to use my mind and how to visualize the
Mm,
power of visualization for competing. And so I have this really big aspect to the programs that I teach that's all about, creative visionary bodhisattva, which is more the Eastern philosophy part. But the visionary piece, like that trinity of learning for me was through my father, through growing up as an athlete, and through the
mhm.
plants teaching me that our minds are manifesting all the time.
That's I have a million brain notes right now where I want to go back to. I'll go back to the first one, which is the athlete and discipline part. So you mentioned diving, is that right? Like
Yep.
from the springboards, right? Where you
Yeah.
like do the
Uh-huh.
twist and it looks great.
Yeah.
So yeah, you definitely okay. This is a perfect example of visualizing because you can't really do it in the moment. You have to know exactly what you're gonna do before. How what would be the key element that's a little bit tough to answer, but how do you teach yourself self-discipline if you're not an athlete? What do you think about that? Because I feel like
Whew.
this might be
Yeah.
the biggest struggle for anyone
Yeah.
trying to achieve anything.
Right. Okay. Well, let's back up a second. Um, Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the reflections I get from the people closest to me are like, wow, you have just such a high degree of self-discipline. And in a way, I find that discipline, I think even actually like the narrative of the word discipline makes most people want to cringe. Like we
I
have to
know we're
actually
thinking
change,
army and like being
like
beaten
whip,
up by someone.
you know? And so this is kind of why I wanted to back up because I think in Western mind, we're very self-critical, right? So
Mm,
I think we have to sort of preface the notion of discipline with kindness and self-love and compassion, that this isn't like the self-whip on the back and like you have like the drill sergeant. This is like the actually, when I'm disciplined in the things that I care about, I have more freedom in my life. And there's liberation in discipline and
mm,
and and change. So this is where a lot of like Eastern philosophy comes into my framework because my teacher, my spiritual teacher, she talks about discipline from this perspective of loving kindness, and that when we sit in meditation, for example, that takes discipline. It
yeah.
takes discipline to hold your seat and to stay with it because the mind just wants to be like, "Whoop, go do the next thing or go do that thing." And so it requires discipline to grow and to hold space for change, right? And that kind of dedication is so empowering. And the way that I would say, now that I'm thinking about it, like it's a
Mhm.
muscle that we learn to flex. So um, it's really practice in essence. And I was actually right before this conversation just talking to my friend on the phone. And I am just moving into a new apartment in Austin after being on the Big Island for 10 years. And so I'm setting up my space in this way. Before we started recording, we were
Yeah,
talking about how much we love our stand-up desks, and
yeah.
and our environment is such a big aspect to how we create and how we create structure. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about like, when am I most my creative? Like, when do I get my best ideas? And I've
Mhm.
really designed, like really consciously designed my life to make like the scaffolding of my life and the physical environment of my life to make discipline really easy, you know?
Oh, yeah, I like that. yeah, making discipline easy. I'll backtrack to the self-love and kindness part. That's something I didn't, yeah, I totally did not think about, but you're completely right. If you think about it, what takes us out of what, let's say we're going to do something for 30 days, and most of us would say this is discipline to do it every day, right? The one thing that will take you out of it is usually distractions, because the reason you would commit to something is because you intrinsically believe that it's going to be good for you, you're going to feel great, you want to learn something, etc. And the one thing that will distract you is actually things that usually don't serve us,
Hmm.
otherwise it's just a
Hmm.
different commitment. So I love the self love and kindness, because if you really love yourself to the core, you will go back to that discipline, because this is, and this feels
Right.
better. You're more in flow
Right.
into those activities than you are in the
Yeah.
distraction. Oh shoot, I forgot to clean up, I
Yep.
forgot this, I don't have time to
Yep.
meditate, I have to do all those million things. um
Yep.
it's really
And
good. I
and
love
let me
that.
just add on to this. Like there's this framework that I teach. It's like think about like a cross, a four-way cross, okay?
Hmm.
So you build your life and your environment to support like an open creative channel is kind of how I think about it. And so on the vertical axis for people who are listening just through audio, we have vision, and
Hmm.
then on the above and value below. So we align our vision. This is leadership development, and we can call it creative leadership development, 101. And so we're looking at what is the vision of what we want to create in our lives? What do we care about? Like, why are we doing that thing? And why are we going for that thing? Who are we becoming? There
Yeah.
is so much I could actually say about this, but plant medicines help us to cultivate a sense of inner vision. And this links into really the research and the science behind the power of visualization. And so when we connect, we give ourselves permission, first of all, to connect to a vision that is not yet manifest in our reality. And to say, I can create that and I can go embark on the journey to become that person that is
Mm.
embodying the vision that I held, however long ago. And I think just a caveat in this thinking is that it's not about the outcome of the vision. Like for me, I've written a couple of published books. I built a volcanic hot spring retreat center. I've created a lot in my life. The outcome of the manifestation of the vision is a byproduct of
Mm.
who you become along the
Yeah.
way, how that creative process literally like shapes you into the human being that you're becoming, that no one can take that away from you. Right. So we have this path of vision aligned with our values and taking time to ask ourselves, what do I value? What do I really care about in my life? Like, what's really important to me? And I'm very clear on all of this because I make this actually a practice. And I encourage a
Interesting.
lot of the people that I work with to make this a practice. Actually, cultivating clarity is a habit of high performance. And so high performers are in the habit of seeking clarity more often than people who are not high performers. So it's really like, the proof is in the pudding. So we have the vision and values, and then we have the passion and the purpose. And
Hmm.
that's like the fuel that gives us the stamina. It's like the recipe for grit. Angela Duckworth's grit model is like going far for a long time. Like it's not a short sprint and then you give up. We're talking like life work for decades and decades and decades, and having the stamina to keep doing that.
Yeah.
And so it's really getting clear on what my purpose is here, and then getting clear on the passion that fuels that. And like, that's why I am incredibly dedicated. I have such a high degree of discipline because that sort of framework, that model is very clear in my mind, and I revisit it often.
That's great. It reminds me of a quote. I think it's from Alice in Wonderland, which is, how you get there is where you will get, which
I love that.
which has a
Right,
little
right, right.
twist in it. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's exactly that. I love that you're making clarity a practice, because I even myself, I fall out of the walk, and I never thought of making that. I didn't even think about it as any kind of practice before. So that's fascinating. How do you, okay, how would one cultivate practice to practice clarity? Like, what
Clarity.
does it look like? Writing down things or asking yourself certain questions?
Right. So I personally, and again, major disclaimer, this is not for everyone. I'm just talking about my own personal practice, my path that is true to my heart.
Yeah.
But I have a practice working with my plant teachers. And
Hmm.
so, and I again, my life, the scaffolding of my life is built around integration. Okay.
Hmm.
So I have this very, very strong support network that manifests itself in very many different ways through the community I have, through mentors, through very close friends who also have a similar practice and that we integrate together, through the literal structure of my environment, through my lifestyle. It's built, and through my knowledge and through what I'm learning and how I'm teaching and the output that I put out through my work in this world. So my whole life is really built around tapping into this open creative channel and cultivating clarity in another dimension that feels very alive for
Hmm.
me and that's very informative and that allows me to remember and come back into my heart and what's really important to me, and not, because I need to do this because, I'm just trying to, uh, let me give you an example. So a lot of people have this core wound of not good enough, of
Yeah.
unworthy. And it's this path, then the manifestation of that is proving I need to do, I need to do, I need to
Hmm.
get the credentials. I need to so it's a life of chasing. And so, it could take a long time to actually unpack that sort of core wound where if you have the kind of support and if you're not working with, I recommend working with a guide, or someone to support you in this journey. And you could have one journey to replace, 10 years of trying to figure it out on your own that just snaps clarity into place. And sometimes it's helpful to go into those journeys or even with a microdosing practice and ask that question, like the way that my narrative is. Okay, you know how earlier you just said, wow, I never thought about the practice of cultivating clarity.
Yeah.
Now I just gave you a new conceptual model that now is in your mind. And now your reality, your physical reality and your actions that you take can now start to shift because
Mm.
you have this new conceptual model, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm doing here is actually like offering a conceptual model for a way of living that's possible that might not work for other people, but it works really well for me in terms of how I'm a creative entrepreneur. So I go into these journeys and I ask for clarity because my conceptual framework is that I am in this constant co-creative dance with some life force that moves through all things and that I am a part of it, and that I trust my teacher, my plant teachers and my spirit allies. And, I trust the wisdom that is beyond me,
Yeah.
that is like in collaboration with me. But there's a way that we can communicate with other aspects of ourselves with the help of these very profound teachers that cultures have been working with for thousands of years. So through that, that's sort of the core. And it's, I'll use the P word, the prayer word, but I know it doesn't resonate for a lot of people, but I use it in a different context now after working with medicines for so many years that have really taught me what it means to be living in this prayerful way in my life. And so we could also use the word intentional.
Hmm.
So when I wake up in the morning before a microdosing practice or before I do a deeper dive solo journey, I'll really sit in meditation and like invite spirit to show me the way. Help me
Hmm.
find clarity. I have songs that I wrote that came through spirit that are all about, praying for clarity and cultivating that sense of clarity. So it's a way that it's like a total sort of mindset shift in terms of not figuring it out. It's not analytical. And that's where plant medicines are so amazing because they get us out of our analytical minds where we can
The
start
intellect.
feeling and we can start asking ourselves,
Yeah.
like, what do I care about? And I feel my heart and I feel my body come alive. And I feel like, to me, creativity is actually this very subtle frequency that I refer to as inspiration. And so I
Hmm.
create my whole life around like tuning into that frequency and like moving with it and like cultivating a relationship with that.
Mm.
And that's really important to me. And the more that I revolve my life around that, it births clarity from that
Mm.
place. And then, of course, we can say like simple things. That was a very like tangential answer, but like I can say journaling and, going for walks. Like
Yeah.
when I'm working through my day, I go work in 90-minute cycles, and then I'll take a break and go for a walk to help get clarity and streamline my focus. I think better when my body is moving, and I know
Yeah.
that about myself. So it's even asking, even asking your subconscious mind, like, please show me clarity around this. And even having the
So
awareness
interesting.
that you need clarity about
Yeah,
an aspect of your life is actually a huge quantum leap of awareness,
for
right?
sure. Yeah, I love that. There's a lot. I'm gonna go back to two things. If you're confused, if you're listening, you're like, what are you talking about? I'll just, if you don't understand the spirit part, uh, I'll just, and Laura can correct me if I'm wrong, but if someone like totally does not get that, I would say it's more like follow your intuition. An idea might come out of nowhere. You don't know where. Don't focus on the word spirit, for example. Just focus on like it came. That's it. Or
Yeah.
it's an intuition.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
something you feel. So I love what you're saying is it sounds like it's really about tapping into or intuition more versus the intellect, and the clarity comes from aligning with that intuition. For example, like you mentioned, going on the walk, moving when you're working. Why do we have to sit? If you know intrinsically that if you're going to move, you think better, why do you try to go back to a model that works for others but not for
Exactly.
yourself? So I love that. Okay, so that definitely brings a lot of clarity. Let's tap into that microdosing practice, and just before, because that's something that came up with some of my entourage. People think if you take let's say mushroom, you're gonna see unicorns suddenly and dragons, and you're gonna be running naked in the streets. That kind of like how a lot of people think about it. I would love for you
Uh-huh.
maybe to like clarify a little bit that aspect. And if you're still listening and you still have any kind of doubts, or you're like, I don't understand, don't worry. I've been there. I have plenty of doubts. I'm very from my upbringing, I've analyzed that thing through several angles before I ever considered it,
Right. Right. Right.
and
Right.
then I was
Well,
like,
it's so
oh
funny to
wait,
think about.
why not?
Right. I mean, most people listening to this, do you think that they would know who Tim Ferriss is?
Some of them will. I don't know who else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Tim
know the
Ferriss is
percentage.
very, very successful entrepreneur. He is a huge psychedelic advocate. He had a quote that he said, all of my billionaire friends work with psychedelics.
Yeah.
And so and I don't want to equate money like, oh, you should work with psychedelics so that you can be a better entrepreneur or a better, have more money in your bank. Like, please don't take
No,
that out
because
of
the opposite
context.
might arrive. You want to become a carpenter and do nothing else.
And so and it actually, like, that happens quite a bit where people are like, I do want to do this psychedelic journey, but I'm not ready to overhaul my life right now. And
Yeah.
I respect that, and so we have to be also aware that changes might happen. We might decide, oh shit, like, I've been valuing something that my parents told me to value, that's not actually true to who I am, but
Hmm.
yet I built my entire fucking life around this value.
Yeah.
And now I need to go through the painful process of reattuning to who I am and what I truly care about. So you could
Hmm.
avoid that your whole life, or you could go on the journey of what it means to be human and, lean into the full spectrum of human emotions. And it's like the arc of the hero's journey when you go
Yeah.
through those experiences. But like the most successful, like intelligent people I know consciously work with psychedelics. It's all about set and setting. Yes. Do you see huge parties happen where people are on LSD and getting naked? And sure, I've been a part of those parties, like, of course, you know, in those settings, when I was younger and less intentional about some of the ways that I was working. But I also believe that there's a very strong place for recreational, quote unquote, use, because some of my most profound experiences were at Burning Man or,
Hmm.
out like at a festival in the crowd of a whole group of people listening to like one of the best DJs in the world. Like that, like, don't tell me that that's not a spiritually transcendent experience, because like it absolutely was for me. So I just think that if people listen to this and you're holding judgment, I mean, that's kind of part of the beauty of psychedelics, is that they help you to loosen your grip over what you believe to be true and get more curious and get more open-hearted and open-minded and be able to have a conversation with someone else without closing your mind and saying you're wrong. And you know what? I would argue that that's like one of the most fundamental ways that we can change humanity for the better right now, is just cultivating the practice of a curiosity mindset. You don't need to work with psychedelics to do that, but they help, they help, and they also help open our hearts and allow us to embody greater degrees of empathy. And considering the fact that we are living in dire times right now, that, we are seeing more division and polarization than ever before, I vote for whatever is going to help us become kinder, more embodied, present human beings that can defer judgment when we're speaking to other people.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. I'll add to that something. In a few ways. So, and Laura, the one of the reason I actually even considered any of that space was because through all my research, I just realized that whether it's mystical experiences, religious experiences, meditation at, let's say, high level, near-death experiences, someone who might be on a marathon and, like at the end of the thread, or an athlete at the highest performance or the most difficult moment, or someone on a very high dose of psychedelics, all the experiences that people were talking about were too close to each other and too similar for me as a scientist, having a scientific background, an engineer, being like, I can ignore that. I could not ignore it once I've seen the data. I was like, wait, all those things are the same. There must be something here. Okay, how? And then there's a lot of education to do around like, how does it work, etc. And that's why I highly recommend no one ever to do it unless, it's your own personal choices in life. But again, you have to understand what it is, how it works, and in what settings and what benefits you can get, depending on what you do, or what are the risks. Also, you mentioned working with a guide if you're doing certain types of practice, or if you're doing the microdosing part, maybe you can do it on your own. We can dig into that in a second, but really understanding that whatever happens, it's almost like you're in a nightmare. To me, like, psychedelics can literally work like a nightmare, where if you've had those, I had tons of, like, I have crazy dreams all the time ever since I'm a kid. So there's always that dream where you're running away from something and that thing just keeps pursuing and you're trying to move and you don't move, or like you're falling forever, etc. Like those kind of dreams. And those compounds, or even through, I don't know, dance, etc., can put you in those states where important material might come up, and that's going to scare you. But our nature is going to be like, oh, I want to move away from it. But what it actually shows is more, from my understanding, is more like, this needs your attention. Please look at it. Don't try to run away from it. A nightmare, the best way to stop it is turn around and look what's behind you, what's chasing you. And you realize it's a teddy bear, or you realize it's a monster and you slay it and you're done. Your nightmare is over and you go pee and go back to bed. So that trust and surrendering, understanding that aspect of, there is something important, a message that's coming across that my subconscious wants me to explore or work on, is key. So let's dive into maybe the microdosing for creativity practice, and be more technical around that, because there's like a million directions we can go.
Oh my gosh. And even just this is such a huge conversation. And I'll send you the link to include for people to sign up to the free 8-day microdosing course, because there's all the basic questions. Like, if you're curious about microdosing and you want to cultivate an intentional practice, then I recommend starting there. It covers a lot of the basics, which we won't cover here. So, and I recommend for people listening, If you've never microdosed before and you want to cultivate a practice, please defer practice until you actually go through the 8-day course, because there's
Yeah.
really good foundational stuff in there, just for your own safety. So where do we want to start with microdosing? It's such a big conversation. Do we want to dive in somewhere specifically?
I think a good aspect would just be explaining to people what it is, how it, we don't know exactly how it works, but how it may work, or at least from all the accounts that you have with people, like how it may
Yeah.
help people. And
Uh-huh.
also just like in what cases it's not a good idea. And before you even consider it, anyone listening, make sure you tried meditating for at least 10 days straight, so that you
Yeah.
understand a little bit how your mind fluctuates, and how you have I just think self-awareness and like meditation is such an easy, low-hanging fruit that without dipping your toes in like stuff that can bring up a lot of more material than you can chew sometimes.
Yeah. And I would say that meditation to me doesn't seem like a very low hanging fruit to stick with it. So
It's
it's
true.
an amazing practice.
It's true.
And it is the foundation. And I really encourage people, as a foundation for any kind of altered state of consciousness work, cultivate a meditation practice as like the foundation. I absolutely agree with you there. So with microdosing, really the definition of microdosing is taking a very small amount. Usually it's a tenth of a dose, although we can't really say that because everyone's full dose is very, very different. There's a very wide range. And so we're technically talking about an amount of a hallucinogen that we're consuming, like psilocybin or LSD, that's in small amounts, that's technically sub-perceptual. Okay. So this
Hmm.
is kind of where the nuance comes in, because it's interesting, and it's a little bit of like a nuance here, that we notice effects, but it's often sub-perceptual, so that you're not paying attention to, like, you're not tripping and seeing everything. It's almost like things are just a little bit more like enhanced in
Hmm.
that way. And it really depends on who you are, what you're doing, what substance you're working with, how much you're taking. I mean, there's so many factors. And that's why I do a lot of like initial, consults and microdosing mentorship for people, so that it's actually like held in a way that optimizes change. And I think that even before we talk about microdosing, it might even just be worth to state that, like, most people come to microdosing and to psychedelics because they desire some kind of change in their
Hmm.
lives. But we know that actually change is hard. It's difficult. Otherwise, we'd just be like all doing all the things that we just snap to, and we're doing that thing, and we're the weight we want to be, and but it's that discipline piece and the change piece and the practice piece. And so psychedelics have some interesting qualities to them, because what they have is a generalizing plasticity effect. Okay. So Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, I highly recommend diving into his research with the entropic brain, and we're looking at pivotal mental states. But as a generalized statement, we can say that when we work with psychedelics, we have these windows of heightened malleability. We're
Hmm.
more shapeable. Okay. We're a little like, for those who are really interested in this, reading Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, is a great place to start, where he talks a lot about the research. And so it's almost like, when we talk about habits, which our perceptions and our beliefs are also deeply ingrained habits, it's like being on a sled on snow going down the hill, where it's easier to go down that same sort of path, right? It's easier to just go down the path that's already been paved.
Yeah.
And that's neurological connections in our mind, right? But when we work with psychedelics, it's almost like there's a fresh blanket of snow, so you can choose a new path a little bit more easily, right? And so when we start looking at the cultivation, so the way that I work with microdosing and the programs that I run and the people I work with, it's I'm not encouraging people to just microdose and then get in the car and go to work. I'm inviting people to cultivate a morning practice, a daily
Hmm.
practice that helps set a foundation that's unique to them, that then is sort of a launch pad for really living our best lives. And we can say that, creativity is humanity at its best, right? Creativity is a way that we're like full expression of who we are. So I really have created a model, and I call it like the 8M microdosing morning flow, where there's different aspects of the morning practice, whether it's meditation or movement. We
Hmm.
also have breath work practices, and music. And so I've, over the years, sort of cultivated this amazing recipe that works really good. And again, it's within the environment that I'm in, that like the scaffolding that I've created for my creativity to flourish. And I create daily morning practices that I know will set me up for an amazing rest of my day. So when I wake up and again, the other piece here is that it's an invitation, like the microdosing, like just how I was saying that, the arriving at the vision of what
Yeah.
you're creating in your life, it's not about the end result. It's actually about who you become along the
Hmm.
way. We can say the same thing with microdosing. It's not actually about the microdose isn't the thing. What's
Yeah.
the real thing is the way that we're showing up for our lives. It's the relationship between us and our plant teachers or the substances that we're cultivating
Hmm.
a very clear relationship with. That's the power, actually. And the power is that in that relationship, there's an invitation for us to show up at our altars, if you have an altar or not, but to show up and actually embody the ceremony of life and
Hmm.
to embody presence and ritual in a way that catalyzes living in a fulfilled, meaningful way. Because when you break it down, everyone is going for that. Everyone is going for happy, joy-filled,
Yeah.
inspired, meaningful life. And so it's really a recipe to codify the struggle and leaving behind the limitations and actually creating a practice, because whatever we want to accomplish requires practice to show up and repeat over again. And essentially, we're practicing open heart and open mind, and we're practicing cultivation of presence. And there's a lot of things we can say that we're practicing, but essentially it's this foundation that then becomes my launch pad for me to really show up in what I'm doing and who I'm communicating with in the interviews that I'm leading or offering, like in this scenario, or the many, many meetings I have throughout the day, or the chunks of content that I'm creating. And it allows me to show up as my best self and to create from my heart with
Mm.
integrity and in right relationship with my life and with whatever you want to call it, universe, spirit, God, it doesn't matter. That
Yeah.
life force that is through all of us. And so microdosing is so much bigger to me than just like focusing in on like the
Yeah.
psilocybin is actually just like 0.5% of what microdosing actually is to me.
Yeah. That's great, especially because what you're mentioning from what I understand now is you're setting the foundation, and then maybe the compound might just help set the foundation, maybe glue it a little bit better or hold through time in a way. Because you, like you mentioned with the fresh powder of snow, you can set a new track, on that specific day, or in that you repeat over time. Um, and this I think is key, especially if you're tapping into creativity. For me, I cannot tap into my creativity, or I can't let it flow if I have a million things I'm thinking about, if I don't feel centered personally, or if I don't feel like I'm in alignment or with what I want to do now. It's like you mentioned earlier, you want to move through with intention when you're doing things. So even if it's just going to shoot out, or like on a photo shoot or whatever, if my mind is somewhere else because I didn't take the time to settle and like be like, okay, this is what's happening now, I can't get there. So I love that it's creating a structure. I think that's why it can be so powerful for a lot of people. It's not just about a compound, it's about that practice you create. It's not like I love to I'm sure a lot of people are like, oh, is it a magic pill? No, it's it's like everything but a magic pill. It's literally something you need to build around, from what I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and really to like link it in even deeper with the creativity piece. So again, I mentioned the word inspiration. And so I
Yeah.
invite actually people who are listening to this to think about the last time that they were inspired.
Hmm.
Just like take a moment to like really think about What were you doing? Where were you? What time of day was it? And how did it feel in your body? And then what was a result of that inspiration? How did that come through you into the world, into what you were doing? There's something about this notion, and I invite people to pay more attention to those moments in their lives where inspiration is flowing through us. Because I kind of see inspiration as being this like direct channel
Hmm.
to like a lot of energy. So it's
Yeah,
like, right? So we have
that's
like
what came up
all
in
of a
my mind.
sudden,
Yeah.
which is there's this like life force that all of a sudden we're carried down the river. We're not struggling upstream. And this is so important. You want to like turbocharge your reality, focus on the cultivation of inspiration in your life,
Hmm.
because there's so many things we have to do as creatives and entrepreneurs that are logistical and, blah, 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 and doing all the things. But when you tap into that channel that is such a distinct frequency, we know it. We know it
Hmm.
when we feel it. It's so distinct that carries us, and it's like 10x. Right? It's better than anything we could have come up with our own minds. It's flow,
Yeah.
right? We know that experience, and it doesn't happen that often, but we can actually learn to pay more attention to it. So just to tie this back in all the way to the beginning of the conversation, when I was talking about we're exposed to so much data and information, it's data around us, but also interoceptive data within ourselves.
Hmm.
We can tune into the beating of our heart or how our gut is feeling. And so if you keep looking at for the same information, you're going to keep creating the same thing over and over again. But now if I say, wake up in the morning and look for inspiration, then your mind, I'm actually activating a part of your brain called the reticular activating system. And now your mind is starting to look for it. And if I say, pay attention to the feeling of it, and we start actually building our lives
Hmm.
around the supporting the opening of a creative channel that actually what it produces what I call golden nuggets. So there are ways that I know how to cultivate that. And
Yeah.
there's ways that I practice, like dancing is part of my morning microdosing flow. When I have speakers set up, it's a part of, again, the environment of the creative environment. I'm
Hmm.
always looking for new music that just lights me up. I'm working with journaling practices, with breath work, with meditation. But when I'm in my channel of my like dancing to music that I love, and I'm really just like ecstasis, then I'm able to like raise my energy to the point where I'm like, oh, I can now hook into inspiration. Because think
Hmm.
about it, it's like climbing a ladder. If you're like experiencing depression, which no judgment, like these are fucking hard times for a lot of people. And I also have struggled with depression in my life. And so I know that place very, very intimately. It's a really hard jump to go from
Yeah.
depression to inspired, creative, open channel. So we do the practices to kind of move up the ladder. Oh, I can reach up one more. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to like encourage myself to think in this way, and I'm going to move my body in this way. I'm going to go for a walk. That makes me feel better. Then the ideas are flowing. So it's a way that we cultivate our lives to literally open that creative channel.
That's I love that the dance part just sparked something, and I was like, if you want to test your own beliefs of judgment that were installed in you, just try dancing in a street,
Yeah.
or without even going there. Try dancing alone in your home with loud music and even stupid music. You will hear your mind go like, this is stupid, you shouldn't do this, your moves are whatever, etc. Like there's like that whole narration that you didn't have as a kid. I have a 2-year old. Nothing exists in the mind. Like it's a blank state. Like the moves just come. Whoosh. There's no judgment. It's just free expression. It's beautiful. But when we go
Yeah.
older, I'm like, this is a great exercise. If you think you don't have filters, try this.
Yeah, it's so or go to an ecstatic dance in your community, and actually this is such a like play. The research shows that the more we play actually is so good for our creativity
Hmm.
and for our creative output and creative expression. And when you think about like, okay, one of my favorite definitions of creativity was by Arthur Koestler that said, creativity is the defeat of habit by originality.
Hmm.
I'll say it again. Creativity is the defeat of habit by originality. And actually, it's so interesting when you look at all the research right now. So much research is coming out about how psychedelics can help treat depression, PTSD, anxiety, and addiction. And that's really where it's catching in the mainstream. Like
Yeah.
psychedelics are being so destigmatized now because now the proof is in the pudding. There's so much research to show that it actually is very, very effective. But one thing that we're not talking about yet as much, although I think it's going to go in that direction, is exploring psychedelics for creativity. The research is going to go in that direction too. But when you look at this definition of creativity, that it's the defeat of habit by originality, you can say the same thing of the healing of depression or addiction. You're choosing a new path.
Hmm.
So we get caught in these cycles over and over and over again, whether it's like ruminative thinking, beliefs that we
Yeah.
just we're not even aware that we keep, circling around. And to sort of like step out of that hamster wheel and say, oh, here's a new thought, or here's a new way of looking at it, or here's a new belief. It's actually how we move out of like mental illness like depression, cognitive flexibility. And it's also the same thing that helps us to think more creatively. And so
Hmm.
one of the ways to catalyze getting out of the hamster wheel is to play and to look at children and the way that they play, because it's like free from inhibition, right? And dancing is such a great way to just like everyone, we can all collectively start just taking ourselves a little less seriously,
Yeah.
right? And I think that that's actually the beauty of medicine and psychedelics and plant medicines, is just how they help us laugh at the irony of life. And that
Yeah.
it's like, we're just here for a moment.
Yeah.
Enjoy it. Don't take it so seriously. It's not about the end destination. The end destination is your own death. So let's, keep that in mind and be able to live in a way that's really true to who we are and to who we are on this path.
That's beautifully put. And there's a good reminder also that I think our civilization is about only 6,000 years old. If we look at our planet, was a few billions. Just
Yep.
to put in perspective, like when we think we're so important, it's like, are we really? Why can't we play more and take it less seriously in a way? Um,
Mhm.
how does do you know, or have you felt, I wonder, as artists, how does one use or has used those plant medicine for art? Actually, I always wonder, because I don't know, I don't think I found a book on that yet, which is one of the reason. Did
Mhm.
do you know anything about how it's being used? Do people actually take some compounds and then start creating, like, let's say, painting or like drawing or photography or
Mhm.
whatever? Or is it more like they will have a journey and then create later something that might have
All of
come
the
through?
above.
Okay.
All of the ways.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there's infinite ways to be creative, and there's infinite ways that people have their creative process. So
Hmm.
one model to even think about is the 4 Ps model of creativity. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Mel Rhodes model. So
No.
when we say creativity, it's such a huge word, and it's kind of
Yes.
like, what are we actually talking about? So he talks about the creative person, like
Yeah.
characteristics of the creative person and mindset, the creative process, like the
Hmm.
process that we go through, whether it's over a course of minutes, hours, or decades, the creative outcome, the product of what we're like manifesting in form. And then we have the creative place, the environment,
Hmm.
which I've been referring to quite a lot in this conversation, which there's so much research that shows how we can set up our spaces to help be conducive to creativity. Now, when I talk to a lot of different people about psychedelic, like people that I know work with psychedelics and that are also artists, I know some people who are like, I never mix them while I don't do
Mm.
psychedelics and paint. And then I know other people who are like, that microdose. I mean, look at Alex Gray. He is one of the most like prolific visionary artists of our time. And he talks a lot about psychedelics and creativity. So there's not one way. And there's also not even one definition of creativity. There are as many forms and definitions of creativity as there are people alive on this planet. Right.
True.
So I think it's really helpful to get into that playful mentality and a little bit of that sort of experimental mentality of like looking at, oh, okay, that works for that person. I'm going to try it in a safe way. Remember, keeping safety like highest priority, and then adjust accordingly and find what works for me personally. And I think that there's this like constant externalization going on, and like we're so pulled outward all the time. And psychedelics and plant medicines give us that invitation. They're like reaching out a hand and saying, actually, come within and find what's true for you. And what does creative expression or output look like for you? And I
Yeah.
think that that's just a really good mentality for all of us to have. Like, yeah, be in conversation with other artists that are also working with microdosing or psychedelics, and remember that there's not one way, and to like play with, like, my perspective is that life is one big experiment. We're all just experimenting. This is one big collective experiment,
Yeah.
individual experiment. So we're just learning. It's emergent space.
Yeah, it definitely is a big experiment. And we have the Matrix coming out soon, or if not already, the new version. Which the old one, once you get into meditation or even the spaces of psychedelics, you're like, oh, I understand why they created that movie. This is literally the first thought that came to my mind. I'm like, I understand why they made that movie now. Like, it makes so much more sense. That how we
Funny.
perceive things is not necessarily how it is, and we don't even know how it could be. So how does okay, this is a tough one, but what would you recommend? And again, this is not medical or legal advice to anyone. Just make sure you're doing things right and check with your doctors if you have doctors, or with your, I don't know, laws in your own countries. What would be an approach, or to someone who's totally new to that space, what would you recommend um in the way, or what would you suggest they look into either before or as a first toe in the water?
Before, like, if people are listening to this have never worked with psychedelics.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
because I'm sure
Yeah.
it will happen a lot, and we don't want to stand off people in the fields for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, having like we said earlier, I think having a solid meditation practice is a really good first place to start. Really depends the spectrum of what people are working with. If you're
Hmm.
listening to this and you're really struggling with depression or addiction, that really does require extra support.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this and you're like, I'm generally well adjusted, things are pretty good in my life, I'm kind of curious what more there is, I would look at potentially starting with a microdosing practice, or working with a guide or someone who can support the container and help
Hmm.
prepare you for that experience. So, a lot of people these days, and I support a lot of people in the preparation and the integration. So, feel free to reach out to me for if that's something that's resonant for you, or if you're looking at a retreat or something like that. I also have a really great document on my website that's 41 questions for vetting your shaman. I also have really
Oh,
great guides for how to have a safe psychedelic journey at home if you so choose. That's your choice. You're making that empowered choice. And
yeah.
also, please be safe. And so I created a guide around safety. There's a lot of information out there around harm reduction, and how to have a safe journey. And if you're working with trauma or with, really overcoming some big things in your life, get support. Even without psychedelics, when you go through like really difficult, challenging
Yeah.
experiences, we're supportive creatures by nature. So reach out. Don't do it alone. We're not meant to do any of this alone, you know?
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, support is, is so underrated. A lot of people see it in a weird way, but I think this narrative has changed, especially with COVID, where people actually understood the benefits of it. And yeah, you mentioned the preparation and integration, extremely important from everything that I've understood in that space. It's as important as one's experience, because a good example can be in life. You might have an experience, but what is going to impact you emotionally and physically is how you take that experience, right? Can be a traumatic event for some people, but not for others because of how they will look and integrate it. Let's say something happened to you and no one ever believes you. That's going to be traumatic in some way. People are going to think you're crazy, but it has happened, deep down. But now if everyone believes you, you're going to think it's normal and you can share it openly. So again, your preparation, what you're trying to achieve, work on, and then how you integrate whatever came up or just your experience talking about it with someone who can hold the space for you is just equally as important. And I'll just say that do not think this is lighthearted or like an easy or like a recreational thing, because it would be the same thing as saying, I'm going to drink a bottle of vodka and go on the highway. You know already, just because the culture is so attuned to alcohol, how it might end. So it's just as powerful as alcohol in a way at high dose. Just don't
and
F with it.
Like even if you do want to have a solo journey, so I kind of like to hold the sort of full spectrum of this awareness. Like one side is that people have been journeying with these medicines safely for thousands of years.
Absolutely.
Okay? So I think that we also like to sort of overemphasize the like fear of it all. But I do like women have been giving birth like in the forest for hundreds of thousands of years. Okay. So like when we think about like, oh my God, giving birth outside of a hospital, that being said, like the medical model is really helpful for saving babies in emergencies or when you break a leg. And so there are models like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, very good model for people working with mental illness like depression or PTSD or anxiety or end of life anxiety. That's another big area that people are seeking out these medicines. And so there's a wide spectrum. And so if I think it's possible to have a safe psychedelic journey at home if you choose, but then basic things that you can put into place at the very least is you have a buddy system. So like when I journey, where I still, after 23 years of journeying, I check in. I have a buddy that if I'm alone, then I make sure that they check in on me. Or if you're new to working with psychedelics and you want just a trip sitter, then not a therapist or a guide or a facilitator, but just someone to sit just in case anything's happened. There are also guides for that. So you can, and I link to that on my website as well. So it's like, if someone else, that you can just give them the guide and to tell them to read this, the information on just how to hold space in case anything happens. The chances of emergency happening is actually really low, like there's not a lethal threshold dose for psilocybin is super, super high. You can't physically consume the amount of mushrooms you would need to overdose. So, I trust the medicine. It's kind of like that saying, trust Allah, tie up your camel. It's kind of like that. Trust the medicine, trust the compounds, and create safety, and do what you can. Like, don't be stupid about it.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that's going to be great for if you're listening to that, just take all those in and do your just keep researching a little bit before you you consider anything. I think that's the most important. Okay, I think we touched a lot on so many things. I want to be mindful with your time also. There is a million avenues we could go in the future. We're gonna keep it there. I love the fact that you're changed that narrative around your own creativity and that you were able to, in a way, overcome or like just change the narrative completely. And I feel like so many of us can benefit from that. So many think we're not creative in those areas. We can't do this. We cannot blah, 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 fill the blank. I think that those tools can be super helpful. So I'm very grateful for you sharing that with us. You have a ton of information on your website, especially for harm reduction, those questions you mentioned for if someone is going to see a guide or shaman or however that person wants to be called. Those questions, I looked through them, very, very important questions, because I think it's Tim Ferriss who said you want to find a person who stays with you when you're in that space with the same amount of scrutiny that you would look if someone was doing brain surgery on you. So just think about it that
Mhm.
way. You can be very malleable, which is great for adding new practices for yourself, but you don't want someone to take advantage of that either. So, yeah.
Mhm.
Laura, is there any place you want to send people to in order to learn more or explore your own universe, or something you would recommend people?
Yeah, so I'll give you the link to my websites and all the links for the show notes because
Yeah.
right now I'm doing a pretty big overhaul into from livefreelaurad.com to lauradon.co. So
Okay.
my new home base by January 1st, 2022 is going to be lauradon.co. And you can find all the projects I'm working on, the retreats, my programs. I'm doing a really big course with the Shift Network starting in February. That's all about plant medicine integration for change makers. I run microdosing programs. I have my free 8-day microdosing course on my website. And please feel free to check out my podcast, the Psychedelic Leadership
Yes, great
Podcast.
podcast. If you want to hear more stories and a little more in depth on some areas, definitely a good resource. Thank you so much, Laura. Everyone, go check out Laura. Everything is in the show notes below or on pierrelambert.com/Laura D. And we will see you, Laura, maybe in a new episode.
Yeah, we will probably have to do a couple of follow-ups. There was so much more we could have went into here, but
I
one
know.
step at a time. I know.
Exactly. Thank you so much,
But thank
Laura.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was such a joy.